A myth, to be a myth, has to be about something that is inherently unverifiable. Not all myths are lies, but actually some of the Greek myths certainly contain lots of material that we wouldn't consider to be true. They contain lots of random, crazy, factually inaccurate material in every aspect of the mythological corpus. In every era, some part of the myths were scandalous, at least a little bit, some aspect of some story. For example, the Titan Kronos, who eats and swallows his son Zeus, the king of the gods. This is not a good thing in any era. The Levantine monarch Tantalus, very famous figure in Greek myth, he cooks and boils his son Pelops and actually serves him to the goddess Demeter, who absent-mindedly munches on him at this banquet of the gods. Yet for some reason we still come back to these stories, despite their unsavoriness, despite their simplicity, despite our difficulty in explaining why we like such absurd, crazy stories. Now, studying mythology or learning about it, which we're all doing, is not actually an activity that needs to be motivated in a very conscious or complicated way. And this in and of itself is a bit strange. You don't usually need to explain to people why you're interested in mythology. And to some extent, we all, myself included, of course in this, are innately attracted by the subject. We're innately attracted by all of the different stories of Greek mythology. The myths and the tales and the legends of the ancient Greek gods and heroes are exciting. They seem to tell us something about ourselves. They seem to tell us something deep about ourselves. And it's not exactly obvious where this feeling comes from. Why do we feel this way about the myths of Heracles? Why are we interested about Kronos devouring his sons? Why do we care about the ancient Greeks generally? So the term myth is in common use in English, and its meanings are actually not all that different from those which were current in antiquity. For example, it's just the main entry in Webster's dictionary. A myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon. And typically, it involves supernatural beings or events. Now, there are two important elements that I want to focus on in this definition. There are many interesting elements, but I want to focus on two. The first is the word traditional. Traditional connotes significance or importance. And the second is the word supernatural, which connotes untruth and lying. Myths are important stories that are also false. And in fact, the Oxford English Dictionary, another very important modern dictionary, defines myth as a purely fictitious narrative. So there's something about myths which are lies, but a myth for us is both important and false. Now, a combination of importance and lying, or untruth and non-truth, always has to be present in any mythology, in any version or any story or any legend. And this is no less the case than with the myths of the ancient Greeks. First of all, the stories of the gods and the heroes were always connected to things of significant social importance, to things that were important to people. This can be seen by the fact that the planets, other than Earth of course, are named after the names for the gods that the Romans took over from the Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Neptune. Like other ancient civilizations, the ancient Greeks associated various star groups and planets, actually the word planetes means wanderer, with mythological supernatural figures. This practice is extremely old. For example, the 8th century BC poet Hesiod called the Pleiades the daughters of Atlas. Orion, known from our constellation, our modern constellation, was actually a hunting companion of the goddess Artemis. But his earliest mention is in the Iliad and is actually as a constellation. So he's probably more prominent as a constellation than as a mythological figure. He appears alongside his companion Sirius the dog star in this connotation. The entire Perseus myth cycle is reflected in the names of the constellations Perseus, Andromeda, Cassiopeia, and Cepheus. For the ancients, just as for us, the planets signified important forces out of their control, forces that humans couldn't understand or attempt to harness. As divinities, these figures were fundamental impersonal forces which needed to be pacified and allied with in order for mortals to traverse the perils of everyday life. Simultaneously, they were important and completely, totally mysterious. That is, any notion of them was unable to be verified and therefore needed to be supported by faith. A myth, to be a myth, has to be about something that is inherently unverifiable. This is an important idea and begins to make some sense of the false part of the equation that we started with earlier. But we still haven't touched much on the important part of the equation, and both of them are equally significant. For us at least, many of the Greek myths seem like the opposite of important. They are tales, tall tales told around the campfire. But Greek myths were not always about weird lights in the sky or gods living on mountaintops. they were also fundamentally stories about the world of men and its history. Things which we, in our world, would definitely consider to be in some sense historical, verifiable, and important. For the Greeks, this would include Achilles and the sack of Troy, and Heracles and his 12 labors, two of the most important myth cycles in all of Greek myth. We can assert with some confidence that these things were fundamentally important stories to the ancient Greeks, even if they're not necessarily important to us. They were important to the Greeks themselves, and very likely not considered to be false at all, at least to the majority of their audience in the time that they were told. And that's important, in the time that they were told. It's here that anthropology enters the picture. The study of myth is primarily a human-centered one, an anthropological one. It's not historical or a literary one, although historical and literary tools and approaches have a large place. An important study published in the 1960s by the anthropologist William Bascomb analyzed recorded observations of folklorists and actually theoretical ideas of anthropologists studying myths in non-literate societies. Bascomb was working in the anthropological tradition, which was primarily interested in the oral traditions of pre-literate societies, specifically for the communities in the Marshall and Tobriand Islanders. The term non-literate is important. Bascomb preferred orally disseminated stories, and he chose to study and to identify myths as primarily living in an oral society. He defined myth as prose narrative, which, in the society in which they are told, are considered to be truthful accounts. By prose narrative, Bascomb meant the oral recitation of a story or tale, not written down. This emphasis on the medium of delivery of a myth and its natural context, in this case oral, is very important. Greek myths come down to us in an incredible variety of forms. Different authors, different contexts, different ways of disseminating this information. For example, our evidence for the astrological theories of the planets and the stars come primarily from Hellenistic and Roman sources. The mathematician Eratosthenes, famous for calculating the circumference of the Earth to a high degree of accuracy, wrote a book called the Catasterisms. This book was a compendium of all the known constellations and the myths that were connected to them. Another example is Manilius, who was a very erudite and sophisticated poet of the early Roman imperial period, who wrote a long poem concerned with the movement of the stars and the planets. And we get a lot of our information about the connection between the gods and the constellations from him. The Astronomica, his book, contained allusions to ancient stories of Zeus, Apollos, the heroes and heroines of Greek myth. These authors and their books are fascinating and amazing, but correctly characterizing their mindset is actually not that easy, especially vis-a-vis mythology. Now, Eratosthenes was a scientist, and Manilius, for his part, lived 300 years after Eratosthenes, and both of these figures were in contact with some of the most sophisticated philosophers and thinkers of their day. There is no clear evidence in either writer that they were strongly committed to the truths of the myths that they were recording. On the complete other end of the spectrum are the Iliad and the Odyssey, the poems of Homer, the Homeric corpus. The Homeric corpus has a completely different presentation context or performance context than Manilius and Eratosthenes. Important scholarship stemming from Milman Parry's studies in the 1920s and 30s have shown without a doubt that Homeric poems display characteristics of oral composition, and this would have gotten Bascomb very excited. The Homeric poems were formed through a process of composition in performance by oral performers, and only later written down. And actually, when they were written down is a source for much contention. After Parry's death, his student Albert Lord wrote a book called The Singer of Tales, and in this book he compared Homeric type scenes and metrical stock phrases and epithets to the modern contemporary traditions of oral heroic tales in Serbia, to these bards in Serbia which told similar tales in a similar way. So it is possible, whether we as a group can consider it likely, we can decide later, that with the Homeric corpus, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have real myth. We have access to the actual true narratives of a community which, in Bascomb's words, are considered to be truthful accounts by the community which told them. It may be that the people and gods depicted in the Homeric poems count as better myths than the stories found in Manilius. We've here entered on a process by which mythological narratives are classed according to how authentic they are, and this authenticity is judged according to how close they are to the native community where they were originally performed. For example, this means that the true story of Achilles is the one in the Iliad and no other, and later cyclic variants, of which there are actually a lot, are really not worth much at all. The desire to authenticate one particular type of story over another is behind the differentiation between different types of traditional tales, which has a long history in folkloric studies and also the study of ancient myth. Usually the differentiation is between three distinct types of traditional tales: folklore, myth, and legend. This three-genre distinction goes way back to Jacob Grimm's preface to his book on German mythology, and for us, Bascomb provides the canonical version of the framework. First, folk tales are prose narratives which are regarded as false, as fiction. 2, legends are prose narratives which, like myths, are regarded as true by the narrator and his audience, but actually they're set in a period considered to be less remote. So in other words, more like real life, when the world was much as it is today. Finally, myths are, as we have noted before, prose narratives which in the society in which they are told are considered to be truthful accounts. Now, the first thing to say is that it's clear to you and me that this scheme, while interesting, does not really work for Greek myth. There are examples of Greek myth that fall in every category: myth, legend, and folktale. So what do we do with that? G.S. Kirk, a scholar of Greek myth in the second half of the 20th century, actually showed that the most common evocation or beginning to a mythological or legendary story was actually the same whether gods or men were invoked, and this kind of flies in the face of Bascomb's theory. In particular, the almost but not quite unique status of the Greek legendary heroic figures makes Bascomb's distinction really problematic, especially the distinction between myth and legend. The three-part distinction of Bascomb would completely exclude the context of the Iliad from myth. This is not acceptable. We have to have the Iliad in our Greek myth, at least for our purposes, for us. I don't know about anybody else. It's not entirely surprising that these distinctions, Bascomb's distinctions, also run into problems when applied to a wide variety of traditional tales or stories or mythological traditions that need to be considered part of the same corpus. Kirk believed that there were three main developments in the modern study of myth. First is the anthropological school of scholars such as Fraser of the Golden Bough and Emil Durkheim, which holds that the myths of primitive, non-literate, and that's important, non-literate societies have something to teach us about ourselves significantly because of their non-literate oral technology. The second development is, of course, Sigmund Freud and his theory of the unconscious, which posits that there's a substrate which binds all of us together irrespective of our primitive or our modern sensibilities. And the third development was Claude Lévi-Strauss and his structural approach to the study of mythology. All three approaches have similarities and differences, but that, of course, is a story for another day which we'll embark on together. I'll see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.